remind everyone that for the Q&A section, which I hope everyone, we can have good participation for, to please stay at the microphone if there's a dialogue back and forth so that we can get it recorded. This morning, I want to introduce LISA BLAS. She is one of the artists in the show Sensations That Announce the Future. And I want to, before I speak more about her, I want to read from an interview that she had in 2011. And as that show came together, there was a realization it was working off of Elaine Scarry's Thinking in an Emergency and how art responds to issues that are sort of, that we feel both an urgency around and a sense of indifference. And so as that developed, it became clear that, and from my perspective, that we're sort of walking into the present future backwards. And so looking towards history, and Lisa's work is very much based in that sort of historical perspective. So she says, traveling engenders activities of documentation and collection. It is akin to plein air observation that is later brought back to the studio for assembly. Such travels have convinced me of the relevance of the 19th century for our present-day experience. When I set to work with materials, I am reminded of what Walter Benjamin's idea, quote, for every image of the past that is not recognized by the present as one of its own concerns threatens to disappear irretrievably. Lisa is a New York-based artist. She works in painting, photography, and installation, and she draws from art history, the history of photography, and current events, as well as a deep interest in this period of the Civil War and Americans' history, and the political legacies past and present. She teaches across disciplines in fine art and art history. She has shown internationally in Brussels, in the Gettysburg College at Musée Matisse. She's taught at the Concurrent College of Art and Design, Université de Lille, and she is, I think, currently giving this year visiting artist critiques for MFA majors in the Department of Visual Art at the School of Visual Art. She has a BA in political science from the University of Southern California and an MFA in painting from Claremont Graduate University. So let's welcome Lisa this morning.
Thank you, Shaw, and thanks to everyone for coming out this morning. It's been a wonderful welcome for me to Olympia thus far. So I just would like to start by trying to go through, I would say, the inspirations for the work I do and then the methodology. And so the first image we're going to look at is really a newspaper image that has been printed with a printing error, and this is something that just is from the New York Times that arrives on our weekend door essentially every weekend. But somehow I felt like this image really is the way in which I enter into my investigations as an artist and how I think about images and how they function in the world. And so the title of the talk is In Times, Some Lands, and These Events. And so I will talk about those three elements as we go through the talk. This image is on my website, and I'm actually a big fan of making charts. And it actually acts as a way for me to structure thought and the way in which I think about making particular projects. And in particular, there's sort of an axis, if you can see, that is on a diagonal. And essentially the axis that's on a diagonal speaks about both the materials forms that I work in and also how those material forms become images and actually how they relate conceptually. So at the very top left, we see material forms as fields. So the actual idea that paper material, the material of a painter, or the material that I work in collage specifically operate as fields of information. Secondly, we have paper that is redistributed, repainted, and reformed. So the idea that the paper material I paint and then cut to make collages has this kind of circulation and distribution in the world. Color as déjà vu. This is something I'm very, very interested in, the idea of déjà vu and how that operates throughout art history specifically and culture at large. And right in the middle is time as collage. And I think that absolutely captures what I try to do, where I try to make cuttings between elements across time and space. So for example, an event or an incident of repetition, let's say an event that happened 150 years ago might have a sort of resonance into the present. That's when I think about the idea of cutting elements conceptually and putting them together in a sort of constellation, that conceptual process then becomes the work that I produce. Nature as a catalyst, one of the things about nature is its unpredictability and its power over our everyday life, even though we sort of go on in daily life and don't really think about it as much until a major catastrophe happens, whether that is earthquakes or tornadoes, meteor strikes. Specifically, I live in New York, so Hurricane Sandy was one of the last events that nature really took hold of the city at large. The next is front page. I am a serious obsessive collector of front pages from newspapers and how those front pages operate vis-a-vis the image on the front page and the language that informs that image, or how the actual news of that particular day is structured around a particular image. And on the other corners here, I would say on the opposite of this diagonal axis, at the top right is agitprop. I'm very interested in the history of agitprop and sort of how it operates in the world on this razor edge of being art as an artwork, art in the name of art, and then art in the name of activism. And I think that those two elements are something that's very much at the forefront right now in contemporary art. So I'm very interested in those histories and trying to access them and perhaps bring them up and subvert them to a degree. And so on the bottom left, we have sediments. So when I think about the idea of building a project, I think about that in terms of sedimentary layers. So sediments really referencing a kind of geological time. And so I have locational, relational, and historical. So those things fall under the sediments category. This image is a camera error. Most of us probably in this room have iPhones and or iPads, for example. And this was, I took several pictures the last time I was doing a talk, which was at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And for whatever reasons, my iPhone created these huge errors in the images. And I thought these images are actually ideal to explain, for example, how I think about images and how they express a particular idea, or also how they're divided into almost these kinds of geometric aspects. You have slices, you have almost squares here that sort of put together the picture as a whole. And somehow I thought that this camera error is very much akin to errors in history and errors in pictures that are put across the internet, for example, across print, books, history, etc. This is a photo, a very blurry photo of my father and one of his friends when he was attending school in the South, in Charlotte, North Carolina. And the reason I have this here is because it's really due to him that I have such a passion for history And I think it stems from this idea of both personal and collective histories as an American coming together. And because my dad was an immigrant coming from the South Pacific, even though that is a US territory, he was the first person to discuss ideas around race when I was actually very, very young. And so somehow this image of him, he's always at the center of many of my questions about art production and about questions of history, current events, and how we're sort of reliving moments continually. These are some more sources for you to feast your eyes on. I love this pairing, which is Rauschenberg on the left, a Time magazine cover from the early 80s, and then the Time magazine on the right-hand side, which was in 2010, talking about the financial collapse and what had happened to the housing market and to everyday Americans who wanted just to try to build their lives. And somehow I felt like there was a relationship between the Reagan era, and what had happened to many of the public resources that were originally funded by the government, and then slowly were whittled down. And so I find there's a kind of causal link between these time periods, 1982 to 2010. It's really not that long of a period, but there certainly is a structural relationship. Here's another pairing. We have Émile Zola's Germinal book on the left and Tolstoy's War and Peace. The subjects of both of these books are very much of interest to me around ideas of social justice, how we actually navigate through the world on either sides of wars. And in fact, if you look at the images, one of the reasons why I paired them together is because you have an actual sort of cannon wheel in Tolstoy's image on the right, and on the left you have what looks like a kind of structural wheel for a working land, oil, water pump, etc. And I really love the juxtaposition of just those formal elements, but also the material that you would access once you would read these books. So the idea of pairing has become very central to what I do as an artist, and so much so that I actually make postings on my website every Monday where I pair a work of art with the front page of a newspaper. And the method in that is actually, I choose every Monday, it depends on the city where I'm at that particular day. And so I take that front page printed image and then I pair it with a work of art. And I'm just going to show you just a few instances of this, how it operates. Okay, so here, I'm just trying to scroll up and down. Okay, here we go. Okay. So here we have Monday, this past Monday, actually yesterday, November 9th, I arrived in Seattle, and so I took the front page photo of the Seattle Times from the internet, and this is a printed version, what they would call the printed version, the PDF version of this particular paper. And then what I do is, using the front page as a guide, I then start to search in archives of various museum collections that I have saved and cataloged, and I try to find an image that somehow resonates to that particular moment in time, that particular newspaper print and image. So here we have a photograph by a UPI photographer who was working in the 60s in New York, and his name is Gordon Gahan. So this is one instance of the pairing. A week prior, I was in Los Angeles. Here was the front cover of the LA Times on Monday, November 2nd. And here's a painting by George Wilkes, who was one of the Ashcan School of painters. And it's really, again, about making both formal and conceptual relationships through a particular time period and a particular day. Here's the week prior, I was in New York, and you can see sort of the visual chaos of this particular image because they're sort of cropped at a strange angle because of the amount of information that you can see on a computer. And so I paired that front page with Judy Pfaff from early 1982. So this process is actually something that I do quite a bit as an artist. And I just wanted to show you one more, another New York Times image of the ongoing refugee crisis coming out of Syria and the Middle East. And this is a screen print that was made by Lady Pink, the graffiti artist working in New York in the early 80s, one of the only women working at that time in graffiti. So this kind of gives you an idea as to how I I think you just need to help get back to the PowerPoint. Okay, great. Okay. It's an example of how I make these pairings through images and through history, and it really explains, I think, the processes that I go through to form the projects that I do. So I'm going to show you some influences because I think it's important, especially in a university context. How does an artist make their work and why do they make the work they do? And here's an artist that I found in the Met's collection, Mary Delaney, who was an artist working in collage in the late 1700s. And this is what they called at the time paper mosaics. And then skipping forward to Belgium in the 20th century, this is an artist, his name is Guy Mays. And I just wanted to read you this. The title, Verloren Ruimte, Lost Space, is a recurrent theme in Guy Mays' work. He first used this term for a group of works with industrial lace, sometimes incorporating neon light, which were created between 1960 and 1966. The lost space is both a textual and a visual reference to the shattered pictorial space where not only the act of painting, but also the representation and the bordering framework are called into question. And this text was written by Dirk Snauert, who's actually the director of Wilkes Contemporary Art Center in Brussels. Here are more Guy Mays' works. Around 1983, he seems to have found a definitive form. The pastel colors are now given independent character in that he cuts the shapes directly out of colored paper and combines them into a composition. The wall reliefs soon evolved into an open structure with a directed movement and a tense rhythm. Because of the way the shapes are fixed to the wall fulfills a dual function. Literally, of course, it closes off the space in which the reliefs are hanging, while figuratively it also forms part of the composition as the negative shape, the projection wall against which the composition of color stands out. Mays uses matte, shiny, semi-matte, and metallic kinds of paper, sometimes even newspaper, textiles, or painter's canvas, and aluminum foil. these works articulate conceptions of space that make interpretive and reflective viewing possible, and away from the passive, deferential contemplation that leads to immersion. This structures the act of being absorbed into a space of purely optical weightlessness. There is a playful, frivolous lightness here that allows the content and the optical aspect to merge into a symbiosis. And here you can see fragments of aluminum foil. This is the way his work is many times installed on the wall, where you have these long, very sharp slashes, really, if you were to almost look at a Fontana painting and take out, for example, the shape in that Fontana painting and affix that to a wall. There's a real similarity in terms of the cutting. Here are more of Guimet's works. Very ephemeral, and the way in which the shapes and the lines work have been a great resource for me. Here's an image from actually a recent exhibition of Corita Kent that I was lucky enough to view on the very last day in Pasadena, California. And this work is titled My People, and it's from 1965. These images are essentially in the public domain now, because the photographer, I should say, is, I'm not exactly sure in my research who took these images, but these images were actually used during the 19th century when the Civil War was actually gearing up. And what you see on the left is the image of an African-American boy who looks like a slave, and on the right would be how he could serve his country in uniform, and in this particular instance as a drummer boy. And again, I'm putting these two pairs of images, this pairing together, because of the sort of edge of identity where you have someone who is really disempowered, and then on the right-hand side you see someone who is quote-unquote empowered. This is one of probably the most famous images photographed by Alexander Gardner in the 19th century, where you see President Lincoln inside of a tent with General McClellan, who he would soon fire because he was unhappy with his strategies as a general during the Civil War. This is actually at Gettysburg. And I love this image because it's so composed in terms of the way in which the flags and the tablecloths are resting. On the bottom left-hand corner, you can see the Confederate flag, which is folded. It looks almost like a Union Jack, but it's folded on the ground as if it's a kind of still life object. And on the top of the table, just below Lincoln, you see the American flag. And there obviously was wind on that day, because you can see that the stars have actually almost blurred in that photograph. And one of the things that I absolutely love about the structure of this image are the cuts of the tent, the shapes of the way in which that tent is cut into a V. Those shapes, again, recur in the way I make collage work, but I love the fact that we're a viewer looking through the lens of a camera, but then there's this whole other mise en scène that's almost behind this tent. So there's almost three sorts of spaces of viewing. And not to mention, it's just a beautiful photograph by the way the angle of light falls on the side of General McClellan's face. Lincoln is very visible. We know it's him, his profile, and he was absolutely aware of the power of his own image in photography. Alexander Gardner photographed him many, many times during the Civil War. This is probably one of the first images that started off a 5-year project entitled Meet Me at the Mason-Dixon, and it's really the reason why I moved from Los Angeles to the Washington, D.C. area, so that I could have access to the material resources of the American 19th century. Growing up in Los Angeles, if any of you are from California, that is a landscape of erasure, in a way that the East Coast is a landscape of preservation. So I feel as if I've always been working with that dialectic, the idea of erasure and preservation. And here, the first work I did when I moved to Washington was I photographed the monument of Grant, General Grant, in front of the Capitol building. And what I did was I scanned, first I had a book of Grant's memoirs. This is chapter 15, the first page. And coincidentally, Ed Ruscha was speaking at the National Gallery of Art in DC, and I brought my book to him and I asked him to sign this page, this particular page, because it chronicles Grant's period of moving to California during the gold rush period, where he talks about how the idea of the West was this unfettered landscape of possibility. And I wanted to essentially pair two heroes, one hero of art history, Ed Ruscha, with an American hero coming from history, who is Ulysses S. Grant. And so this piece is entitled "My Crush on Generals," or "A General Crush." And it actually also, I guess, reveals the weight of powerful male heroes throughout both art history and American history. So on the right is actually a photograph that was made. The book page that Ed Ruscha signed was made into a photograph, and this exists as a diptych. And this was the first iteration of, I'd say, I was at probably 3.5 years of the 5 years of the project. And it was the first iteration in a gallery in Washington, D.C., where I covered a wall in really a palimpsest, where you have varying elements of maps, personal effects, paintings that I've made, drawings, horseshoes that were made out of paper pulp, so sculptural elements, flags, ribbons, anything that actually chronicled this process of making the project. And so the scale of this is about 12 feet, 8 by 12 feet long. This image, actually, I photographed while inside the Gettysburg cyclorama. And if any of you have ever been there at the National Park, there is a sort of spectacular light show, which falls upon the cyclorama at different moments. So essentially the painting illuminates in different colors. And this to me was very resonant in terms of it being almost a cinematic image. So I photographed it right when this particular portion of the cyclorama was lit with this blue light. Here's an up-close detail of the installation, Meet Me at the Mason-Dixon, the larger wall work that I installed at Gettysburg College in 2011. And it sort of gives you an idea of the layered paper and the sort of historical building of erasure preservation that I was speaking about earlier. The Washington Post article that you see that was about a young African-American woman who died in Najaf during the Iraq War, and she was one of the first female military officers of African-American descent to make it to West Point. And she was killed in Iraq at the age of 23. Here she is. Her name is Emily Perez, and I repeated her West Point photo several times in an image as if I was actually trying to preserve this repetition of her memory. And this also was part of that installation, the wall installation. Amidst that wall installation were also personal effects that chronicle one's identity. And in this particular issue, my father, who's at the center, sitting there on top of this, what he has written here, storage in the Colosseum. And I just absolutely love the very accidental composition of this image. It reminds me a lot of, I would say, if you took screenshots out of Antonioni's film L'Avventura, this sort of reminds me of that. Here is an image of an antebellum mansion that was wiped away from Hurricane Katrina. So this information also was in the large wall work. This is now 9 by 15 feet installed at Gettysburg College. Here was sort of a installation shot of that exhibition, which composed of the wall work and several paintings in addition to photographs. Here you can see a portrait painting of Emily Perez and photographs that are on the right-hand side. This is actually a C-print, and I made an actual collage with slide labels and stars, the kind of material you get when you've done a good job when you're a child and your teacher gives you a star in your homework. So I used these very ephemeral materials, made a collage on watercolor paper, and then had those collages scanned and made into C-prints. Here were also 2 portrait paintings from that exhibition, and again, you see the repetition of a pairing. Here on the left-hand side is Pauline Cushman, and she was an actress who actually disguised her gender and was a spy for the Union Army, went on the road with the Confederate Army and would send back their plans in her shoes. And she, after the war, she was made into a hero by Lincoln and then ended up going on the road with P.T. Barnum's Traveling Roadshow. On the right-hand side is John Wilkes Booth, obviously much more well-known as a figure, but part of the Meet Me at the Mason-Dixon project was about ideas around American identity and specifically fame, criminality, and heroism. So on the left, Pauline Cushman represents fame, and on the right, John Wilkes Booth represents criminality. Here's an amazing, beautiful image by Timothy O'Sullivan, who worked for Alexander Gardner during the 19th century for his studio, but I absolutely love the panorama here of men in the field getting ready for an actual military action. That expanse of Timothy O'Sullivan's image then caused me to work and seam some photographs together, landscape photographs. This image is actually 2 images that are seamed together, and it is in Lexington, Virginia, where it's at a particular site, a gravestone where a Confederate general had been killed, and so I'm actually seaming these 2 images together and making a panoramic photograph of that. The seaming continues, and this actually was something I had done quite recently and posted it on my website, where after Charleston, I had to sort of address my feelings about what had happened, and I decided to write a short text that's on my website, but I needed to actually do a pairing of 2 images together. So on the top, what you're seeing is actually an image by a photojournalist. Her name is Stephanie Perenchio, and this is a New York Times image of her photographing the Navy SEALs and during their training exercises. And below are 2 seamed images that I photographed at Cold Harbor, which is a place in Virginia where there was a battle and the actual physical trenches of the land still exist. So here I wanted to have a juxtaposition between an actual metaphorical present and past operating in the same pictorial space. So it's as if this Navy SEAL who, for example, was part of the team that went after Osama bin Laden is dropping down into history, but into the space how it exists today in Cold Harbor. And from there, the collage work begins, and I'm just going to read you something by an art historian, Robert Slifkin, and this is from his book, Out of Time, Philip Guston and the Reconfiguration of Post-War American Art. Quote, identifying points of origin is an intentional act that authorizes the construction of a synthetic account of a temporal sequence of events. To relate two moments means not only recognizing established connections, but also forging such relations between the periods, thereby recuperating aspects of the past visible only in light of the present and revealing aspects of the present visible only in relation to the past. So these collages are some of the first collage works I made on music paper, and it's very hard to see the actual music lines in the projected image. Maybe if the lights were turned down a little further, you could see it. But in terms of the actual material, the material of these two collages stem from a whole new way of working when I moved to Europe after the 5-year period in Washington, D.C. And I started to use cardstock that was coming in through the mail and finding areas where there was just pure color. So similar to Guy Mays, we're using areas of metallic color and flat color and cutting out those areas to build a palette. And these images actually stem from 2 different exhibitions, one of which was at the Musée Matisse, and the other one is at a gallery in Brussels, where you're looking at here. And these images are reimaginings of the flower that Europeans wear on Armistice Day, the poppy. And this is a reference to World War I. And these were also made at the same time. The difference is the scale and the material. We have about 20 by 26 inches here. The same kind of collected material, cardstock. Much of that cardstock is coming in from museum announcements and creating these abstract compositions where there is a sense of a kind of borderline that has become invaded, or very, very sharp edges, and many times people have told me those shapes, those elements are reminiscent of a kind of shrapnel. Here's another installation view of the work. And the 2 large works on the right-hand side are also some of the first works I made when I was in Brussels. And the background white paper is actually, what you see here are 2, 4, 6 sheets of 24 by 24 inches that are paired together to make the background, the white paper. And then the collage material, the colored elements, the fragments are affixed to that. But that white paper actually is generated from a Felix González Torres work that was exhibited in Brussels in 2010. Here's another image on vellum, same scale as the other one, 20 by 26. And here I'm looking very much to ideas of nature and borders, so elements where there's a kind of border clinging to either side of the pictorial space, but there's a kind of blankness or a negative space in the middle that is sort of very present, as present as the actual fragments of the collage material are. Here's another installation shot of the gallery where you have the 3 works on vellum on the left, the 2 large works which are mounted on Felix González Torres' paper, and on the right-hand side, the collages on music paper. Here's another image, again, trying to cling to the edges of the paper and create a very sharp sense of the color, either cutting through the paper or coming through from the back. And this one in particular, I think, was very informative for me because even though the material sits on the surface, there's an element because of the color, the palette of those purple fragments, those shapes. It seems as if it's sort of bleeding in from underneath. And that turned out to be very informative to future work I would make. At the same time that show was up, I mounted another similar wall work on the ground floor of that gallery in the building in Brussels. And essentially it composed of various elements that informed the collage works as a whole. Here you can see the presence of language that becomes very prominent in my work to come. This is actually fragments of wall text that come out of the American wing in the LA County Museum of Art. There's a frontal view of what the installation looks like on the ground floor. So I guess I very much understand this strategy or this relationship to creating almost poles of resistance in a show. So, for example, presenting collage works that are in a particular kind of visual language, and then you have this wall work, which is a sort of entry point into maybe how those works were made. And I think it creates counterpoints for the viewer and points where you might be able to think about different aspects of how a work is formed. This is another element of the text that was in that installation. And these are from a series of posters, actually, that I made in Europe. And the title of that series was Civil Disobediences. The collage work then continued where I really was focusing on the idea of blankness and negative space existing between very sharp cuts of the collage material. And I learned this term while I was living in Belgium. I guess I really focused on it because I was speaking French, and that term is hors champ, meaning off screen, the thing that exists outside the screen. And so I began to think about that a lot. And informing collage works, for example, what we are looking at is actually off the screen. It is not in the center. It's not completely visible. The collage material here is, I'm still using this collected cardstock. What you can see are remnants of the red and white that comes from an American flag postcard. And that's similar here, also the stars. This is watercolor paper 20 by 26. This is vellum, also 20 by 26, but again, trying to understand space and fields around these sharp areas. Then I began to think quite a bit about making my new project, which was about this relationship between nature, art history, and civil unrest. And what I decided to do was focus specifically on a work by Robert Smithson, Partially Buried Woodshed, that was made in 1970, installed on Kent State University's campus. And this is on vellum, 20 by 26 inches, and I'm still using the cardstock collected from my collection of postcard stock, but then I began painting the surfaces of these elements to give it another layer of visibility. At the same time, I was asked to do an edition of photographs for a magazine, Material Press, which is run by artists in Los Angeles. And what I did was I made 4 collages on the A4 music paper I had been making all along. And so I made a representation of Smithson's work, which is on the upper right-hand side, out of American flag postcards. And the Times logos comes from the Times-Picayune newspaper in New Orleans. So it's very similar to the New York Times logo, and I wanted to pair those 3 elements of the Times with Smithson's image, my representation of his image. So these 4 collages were seamed together, scanned, and printed into photographs. Here are the drawings that Smithson made prior to his installation at Kent State. And it's very interesting to think because he originally had another work planned for that campus, and because of the weather, he had to change directions. So here we have an idea as to how the shed was going to be collapsed by several tons of dirt. Shortly after I moved to New York, I was invited to participate in this exhibition entitled A Particular Kind of Solitude, and it was an exhibition based on the writings of Robert Walser. And so the project took place in NoHo and at a very specific place called the Elizabeth Street Garden. And if you can see in this image, there is a reflected window that almost looks as if like it's a mirror. And at the same time, I photographed the space because I was trying to figure out what I was going to do for this project, given it was an outdoor exhibition. I then found this work by Smithson, Mirror Thickets, which was a drawing for a proposal, another one of his pieces. And I began to think about the idea and the shape of a mirror. Here are works on vellum 20 by 26, which are representations of the mirror, which would be this empty void at the center, and then the perimeters are using these collage elements. Here are the collages on A4 paper that I ended up making several of these for this exhibition. And you can see that the shape of the center of each image is very much akin to the window, the reflected window that you had just seen, and the mirror in Smithson's work. And here is an example of a microscript by Robert Walser and the shape of that microscript. So I was actually drawing a relationship, a pairing between two Roberts, Robert Smithson and Robert Walser. These are actually collages of the text that is from a piece that he had written called The Walk. And I wanted to use this typography that I had begun using a few years ago to make language, fragments of language exist in space next to actually image works. During the run of the exhibition, I was introduced to Linda Montano, and she introduced me to Rachel Devora Trapp, who was just about to start her PhD down at UVA in Charlottesville, and she is a composer, and she actually did a performance where she interpreted my collages as an actual musical score. Here we see more images of, in the A4 scale, the music paper, of Smithson's iconic work, Partially Buried Woodshed. And then moving on to 20 by 26 vellum works, where you can actually see the reflected surface of the collage elements due to the use of interference and metallic paint on the surface. These shapes and the lines, the cuts, they're continual for me, and they really are very present over the last 5 years in terms of making. And the images are always concurrent with this examination of language. And these are other pieces that I do on A4 music paper, where I take fragments of typography and language from newspapers and try to make pairings of language. So if we talk about ideas around metaphor and metonymy, I think I work quite fluidly between those two elements. Here's another collage on music, on watercolor paper, and it, I think, demonstrates the idea of a kind of space, a fractured space, but a space that really is trying to hold these magnetic fields of very, very sharp cuts in the collage. This is also on vellum. This is actually a very pared down idea of what the structure of Smithson's woodshed would be, very much reminiscent of the leftover foundation that now exists at Kent State. So this pairing of nature, current events, and civil unrest the element of nature here is actually a almost very difficult to photograph metallic representation in terms of the color. It's a representation of a meteor and the idea of an actual event from nature that is exploding through the pictorial space. This is actually an image based on a photograph by Carlton Watkins of meteorite fragments that were found in the 19th century and that he photographed. And the shapes of those fragments had an absolute similarity to the way in which I was working in collage. Here's another representation of a meteor with varying tones of gold and silver and iridescent paint, the kind of work that's very, very difficult to photograph, but it still has this sort of presence in a very subtle yet powerful way. So what you see here then is this continual examination of nature on sheets of vellum, and what you're seeing here are two different modes of display. So there's actually two images, there's two works on vellum that are made, and then they're positioned one on top of the next. So on the left, you see the positioning of two pieces of paper on top, and on the right, the same thing, but they're just A over B or B over A. Here's a similar methodology. This is 20 by 26. These images are based off of photographs from the 19th century of algae and different forms of botanical sources. So the nature exists very much sitting next to ideas of catastrophe and civil unrest. And here is a text work operating in the same way, where you see the text floating on the top and behind. So these are two sheets of vellum sitting on top of one another. Deepwater Horizon, of course, was the oil spill that happened 5 years ago after the very catastrophic event of the hurricane in New Orleans. These are more images of nature that exist with these two pieces of vellum. And the photographers that I've been looking very closely at are Anna Atkins, Talbot, Adolf Braun. So many of these people who took very, very specific ways in which they examined nature. Here's one of the works that's in the show right now at Evergreen, and it was interesting because I had a studio visit recently. Gosh, it must have been about a month prior to Shaw inviting me to participate in the exhibition. And the curator said to me, she said, "Wow, are you going to exhibit that?" And I said, "I don't know." And then just by serendipity, we decided that this work was going to go into the show. But the idea of the fragility of nature sitting next to civil unrest, I think, is very much a chronicle of what we're experiencing today. This is another work that's in the exhibition, and this is the Infinity series after Anna Atkins. Two pieces of vellum again, sitting on top of one another. Then we go to very large-scale work that's part of this entire project of an art historical moment, meeting a moment in nature, meeting a moment of civil unrest. And this is a text that I had made as if it was an imaginary newspaper article, waiting for a miracle still. And this comes very much from looking at the newspapers after Hurricane Katrina, the Times-Picayune newspaper in particular. And the scale of this is 51 by 90 inches on Arches paper, so quite a jump in scale. Here's another image based on algae, and this is also on vellum, 20 by 26. Seeking Solid Ground, another work on vellum, which is also in the exhibition. And this actually comes, it's an extract from one of the newspapers that I was collecting at the time in which Hurricane Katrina took place. The typography, by the way, is actually somewhere between, I would say, the New York Times font and the Times-Picayune font in New Orleans. And it's a Gothic font that I had a wonderful conversation with my brother about because he's a designer. And I'm continuing to use that font quite a bit. And here is also a work that's 51 by almost 90 inches, and this is one of the first large-scale representations, images I made after Smithson's woodshed. Here's a detail so that you can now see how the collage material has moved from this collected resource of postcard stock, and now where you're seeing I'm actually painting on sheets of paper and cutting that paper up into fragments so that I can get more of a varied resonance on the surface to the material. And here is, again, another image that's about 51 by 90, and this is the Times-Picayune logo from the newspaper in New Orleans, which, by the way, I'm sure we all know won several Pulitzer Prizes for the reportage after the hurricane, and now it's been downsized to print only 3 days a week. So I feel as if it's very prophetic in the way in which events have taken place since those moments. Here we have another very large image. I made Seeking Solid Ground larger on the Arches paper, 51 by 95 inches, and where the actual letters, even though they form words, I really see them as visual fields so that they become almost, the typography is like its own object in a sense. But the thing I would love for a viewer to feel is if you were seeing through the image with those letters instead of the letters addressing you only. Here's another large 51 by 80 inches of a meteor that I took an example that where an event from nature occurred in Siberia. There was a meteor strike in 2013. And so I took images from the newspaper of this particular meteor strike and used this as part of my larger project. This is another image of nature on vellum, and this goes directly to these resources from 19th century photographers. And here we have a work on vellum and referencing specifically Kent State and 1970 as being the marker of time, not only when Smithson installed partially buried woodshed, but when students were murdered by the National Guard for protesting the Vietnam War. Here's another image of nature examined through a photographic lens from the 19th cyanotypes. These are based on cyanotypes by Anna Atkins. And here's a vertical work that is almost blinding. It's very difficult to see this and photograph it because it's using such an intensely iridescent and blinding yellow. And this is a reference to what's happening to the land around the Gulf since the BP oil spill in particular. Another image of nature existing next to an image of unrest. Here's a detail of another meteor image that I had made. So you can see the shapes and how the color sits on the surface. I'm very interested in the way in which color resonates and sits next to each other in terms of pieces. And I guess from my examination of so much early photography, I became very interested in the way in which, for example, the copper and the silver in a daguerreotype, the surface of the glass, how that there's a kind of ghostly apparition that appears when you look at the surface from left to right. And so that aesthetic experience has very much guided my palette, which is very particular, and tries to use incidents of this kind of iridescence and metallic, flat, field, squeegee, breakdown of pigment, almost watercolor, to try to have all of these things operating on the same plane. This is another work on vellum, high road, low road. And this is another very large work, 51 by 80, probably 88 inches, I think, not quite 90. And this is actually a representation of the interior view of Smithson's woodshed. And the palette for this particular work is directly referencing a painting by Manet, and that painting is The Execution of Maximilian. This is a diptych where I actually have fields of words that are almost supposed to be read left to right and then diagonally, so they operate in a kind of grid. This is another representation of a meteor that is hugging almost the very edge of the picture plane and leaving this gigantic space, open field in the center. And I'm just going to conclude with showing you some templates, some examples of what I've been working on for this forthcoming issue of Public Art Dialogue. And that issue is directly addressing the impermanence of public art, specifically the history of monuments after Charleston, for example, the way in which we now consider flags, specifically the Confederate flag, or monuments that illustrate our history, and whether or not these markers of our history are actually as needed in the culture anymore. And so the issue should be forthcoming, I think, in February or March of 2016. And here are some of the images, the templates that I was working on. So what you see here is fragments from my collage practice, colored painted paper, the fragments of an American flag postcard, and where the D is in wetlands is actually a souvenir photograph of the monument to Stonewall Jackson in Richmond, Virginia. These images are meant to be very ephemeral, and they always feature the Confederate monument to Stonewall Jackson amidst these other signifiers of American history. Here we have Kent State, again, with Stonewall Jackson's image hovering in this liminal space behind the cutout of the S. Here it is again, sandwiched in the middle of cut-ups of the American flag postcard, the American flag itself, and then a gold background of paper that was collected from art forum advertisements. The idea of these works is that the notion of our cultural signifiers are very fragile and ephemeral, as is the material that I have made these still lifes with. And in fact, the project itself is entitled The Instability of Nature Morte. Here's another image of the fragments of my collage practice with these signifiers of American history. And then I will conclude with Midlands, with Stonewall Jackson sitting at a vertical where he might be collapsed or falling through that pictorial space. Thank you.